Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
I am so excited to get into our topic today.
Me too. And to kick off this deep dive, I actually want you to imagine something. Picture yourself walking into a courtroom.
Okay, I'm there.
So you walk in, and a father steps right up to the judge. He points directly at his own daughter, and he states with just absolute stone-cold conviction that if she doesn't marry the man he has chosen for her, the law says he can have her executed.
Right, which, I mean, that sounds like the setup for a dystopian thriller.
Exactly, or some dark true crime documentary. But no, you are actually looking at the opening moments of William Shakespeare's most famous, supposedly lighthearted comedy, A Midsummer Night's Dream.
It really shatters the expectation we usually bring to a classic piece of literature, doesn't it? Completely, because we tend to approach a 400-year-old play expecting something, pristine, something safe, neatly categorized behind museum glass. Right. But right out of the gate, we are thrown into this profoundly wild, high-stakes landscape. I mean, on the surface, if you just skim a summary, you'll read about delicate fairies, right? And a magical love potion, and a group of bumbling amateur actors putting on a terrible play.
Which honestly sounds like a children's story.
Yeah, it really does.
But the deeper you go into this deep dive, the more you realize this text is actually, well, it's a surgical dissection of human irrationality.
Yes, exactly.
We were looking at this perpetual, agonizing tension between the rigid rules of society and our primal individual nature. It's a full exploration of the blindness of love.
And the reality-altering power of human imagination, too.
So our goal today isn't to just summarize the fairy tale for you. We're going to dig into the actual mechanics of this famous story. We want to act as guides to help you extract the practical wisdom and the life application that's just buried beneath all that poetry.
And to do that, we really have to ground ourselves in the historical and psychological reality of that opening scene you mentioned.
Right, the courtroom scene. Or, well, the throne room.
Exactly. So we are in ancient Athens. Duke Theseus is preparing to marry Hippolyta, the queen of the Amazons.
Big royal wedding.
Huge. But their wedding planning is violently interrupted by that furious father you talked about, a man named Aegeus.
And he is just completely out of his mind with anger.
He really is. He's demanding the absolute strict application of Athenian law regarding his daughter, Hermia, because Hermia is in love with this young man named Lysander. But Aegeus has decided she must marry a different man, Demetrius.
So he brings her before the Duke.
Right. And Aegeus invokes what he calls the ancient privilege of Athens. He actually tells the Duke, as she is mine, I may dispose of her.
See, dispose of her. That phrasing is just so jarring today.
It is.
It completely reduces a human being to property.
Well, legally, in the context the author is drawing from, which is kind of this blend of the patriarchal structures of ancient Athens, Roman paterfamilias, and the realities of 16th century Elizabethan England, she literally was property. Yeah, Aegeus isn't being metaphorical there. He is invoking a very real legal framework where the patriarch holds the power of life and death.
So if she refuses his choice?
Her options are literal execution, or she must become a celibate nun, locked away in a cloister for the rest of her life, chanting, as the play says, faint hymns to the cold, fruitless moon.
Okay, but I'm struggling to square this with the genre. I mean, why start a comedy with the literal threat of a young woman's execution?
It's a fair question.
Because Duke Theseus backs Aegeus up. He basically tells Hermia her father should be a god to her. Doesn't that just make the rulers look like tyrants? It just feels incredibly dark to set up a story about fairies and love potions with a literal death sentence.
It does feel dark, absolutely. But psychologically and narratively, this extreme stakes setting is the necessary catalyst.
How so?
Well, Athens, in this text, isn't just a physical location on a map. It is a symbol. It represents pure Apollonian order, its reason, daylight, the intellect, and rigid societal boundaries.
Okay, I see.
The author is placing a universal human problem center stage here. The violent clash between the unyielding expectations of society, like the law and parental authority, and the unpredictable, highly individualized nature of human desire.
Right, love.
Exactly. Love. Think about it. If the law were just a mild suggestion, Hermia and Lysander would simply stay in the city, argue with your dad, and, I don't know, maybe go to couples counseling.
Yeah, the inertia of a comfortable life would just keep them there.
Exactly. People rarely abandon the structures that define them unless the pain of staying outweighs the terror of leaving.
That is such a profound point.
The threat of death creates an environment that is so fundamentally incompatible with the human heart that it basically forces the characters out of their socially acceptable lives. It drives them to flee into the unknown. They are seeking a place where, as Lysander says, the sharp Athenian law cannot pursue us.
The sharp Athenian law. That is a brilliant phrase.
It really is.
It cuts, it divides, it defines boundaries, and so they run. And I think, for you listening, this physical movement from the walled city of Athens into the dark, uncharted woods mirrors a psychological journey we all eventually have to take.
Oh, without a doubt.
When our internal desires clash with external realities, we have to leave those known structures to figure out who we actually are.
And the moment they cross that threshold into the woods, the rules of Athens completely dissolve. Reason is left right at the city gates. We transition from this Apollonian world of order into the Dionysian world of chaos and nature.
Which brings us to the core mechanism of this entire text. The absolute irrationality of affection, and what the play presents as the love potion of the mind.
Yes, a potion.
Before the characters even get deep into the woods, we hear from Helena. Now, she is Hermia's childhood best friend, and she is desperately, hopelessly in love with Demetrius.
The very guy who is legally supposed to marry Hermia.
Right. And Demetrius treats Helena with profound cruelty. He tells her the sight of her makes him sick. But she ignores every piece of empirical data about how terrible he is.
Because she's infatuated.
Exactly. And she delivers probably the most famous psychological insight of the play. She says, "Love looks not with the eyes, but with the mind, and therefore is winged Cupid painted blind."
I love that line. Helena is articulating a profound truth about human neurobiology and psychology centuries before those fields even existed.
She really is.
She recognizes that her affection totally defies objective reality. By all logical metrics, Demetrius is a terrible investment of her time and emotion. But love doesn't use the eyes. It doesn't see facts.
It uses the mind.
Right. It uses the imagination to project value onto the object of desire. We don't fall in love with the objective person. We fall in love with the story our mind tells us about that person.
And Shakespeare takes that psychological truth and turns it into a literal physical object in the woods.
He makes it tangible.
Exactly. Because once we enter the fairy kingdom, we meet Oberon and Titania. They are the king and queen of the fairies. And we meet Puck, this chaotic spirit. So Oberon instructs Puck to fetch a magical flower called love and idleness.
And the mechanics of this flower are absolutely essential for understanding the rest of the story.
Break that down for us.
Okay, so the juice of this flower, if it's dropped on the sleeping eyelids of any man or woman, bypasses the rational brain entirely.
It's like a chemical override.
Exactly. It makes the victim madly dote upon the very next live creature they see when they wake up.
It is the ultimate chaotic variable. And what follows is just a masterclass in compounding disasters.
It's so messy.
It is. Because Puck is supposed to put the juice on Demetrius, right? So he'll finally love Helena back and fix that whole mess.
Yeah.
But Puck makes a mistake. He sees Lysander sleeping in Athenian clothes, assumes it's the right guy, and juices Lysander.
And the fallout is immediate. Lysander wakes up, sees Helena wandering through the woods, and instantly, violently abandons Hermia.
The woman he literally just risked execution to be with.
Yes. He actually says he repents the tedious minutes he spent with Hermia. The cognitive whiplash is just stunning.
It really is. And then, trying to fix the mistake, they juice Demetrius. So he wakes up, sees Helena, and suddenly he loves her too.
Right.
So now both men, who previously wanted to kill each other over Hermia, are ready to kill each other over Helena.
Total chaos.
And meanwhile, Titania, the elegant, powerful fairy queen, gets juiced by Oberon because they are in the middle of this petty marital dispute. And she wakes up and sees Nick Bottom.
Oh, Bottom.
Yeah. Bottom is a boorish, loud-mouthed amateur actor from Athens who just wandered into the woods to rehearse a play. And Puck has magically transformed his head into the head of a literal donkey.
An ass's head.
Right. So Titania, the most glamorous creature in the forest, opens her eyes and instantly falls deeply, obsessively in love with a man with a donkey head.
And, it plays out as pure physical comedy on stage.
Yeah.
But if we look closer, it asks a deeply uncomfortable philosophical question. How much of what we desire is a conscious choice? And how much is just the juice of the moment?
Wow.
The magic flower isn't just a fantasy trope. It is a brilliant metaphor for the transient, subjective, and deeply irrational nature of human desire. I mean, think about Lysander. When he wakes up drugged and suddenly loves Helena, notice what he does.
What do you mean?
He doesn't say, wow, I feel a magical compulsion. Something's wrong with me.
Right.
He says, the will of man is by his reason swayed, and reason says you are the worthier made.
He immediately rationalizes the irrational impulse.
Exactly. He builds a logical scaffolding to support a totally drug-induced emotion.
That is so true. The human brain is just an incredible rationalization engine. We experience a rush of neurochemicals like the dopamine and oxytocin of infatuation, and our prefrontal cortex immediately scrambles to invent logical reasons why this sudden obsession is actually a deeply rational, brilliant choice.
We do it all the time.
We really do. And if we take this out of the realm of 16th century fairy magic and look at the 21st century, I look at this love juice and I immediately compare it to the algorithmic manipulation of our modern attention spans.
Oh, that's a fascinating connection.
Right. Social media platforms operate exactly like Puck in the Woods.
Unpack the mechanics of that. How does the algorithm mirror the flower?
Well, think about how a targeted algorithm works. It observes our behavior, finds our vulnerabilities, and utilizes variable reward schedules, which, by the way, is the exact psychological mechanism that makes slot machines so addictive.
Right.
It curates a highly specific piece of content and just drops it onto our screens, or onto our sleeping eyelids, if you will.
Yeah.
And it completely bypasses our rational Athenian goals for the day.
You sit down to work and suddenly
we are madly doting on a product we didn't even know existed 10 minutes ago, or we are consumed by absolute visceral outrage over a news story that we have zero context for.
The algorithm overwrites our reason.
Exactly. It makes us chase things, buy things, or fight over things that we previously didn't care about at all. The algorithm drops the juice in our eyes, and we wake up in love with a donkey.
And just like Lysander, we defend our algorithmic obsessions with logic.
We do.
We tell ourselves, oh, I'm just staying informed, or I really needed that product to optimize my life. We completely mask the fact that our attention was chemically hijacked by dopamine loops. The text shows us that when everyone is operating under the influence of these shifting, irrational desires, the whole community breaks down.
Which brings us to a really crucial translation of this text from modern life. We have to look at the geographic divide of the play Athens on one side, the woods on the other.
Yes, the two worlds.
Right, and understand what they represent in our psychology today. Athens is our spreadsheet-driven, LinkedIn-optimized, calendar-ruled life. It's the world where everything has a metric, a key performance indicator, and a strict process. It's the 5-year plan.
Athens is where we feel in control. But the woods is the messy, unpredictable domain of the subconscious. If we look at this through a Jungian lens, the woods represents the shadow, the repressed, primal, emotional parts of ourselves that we hide behind our professional, civilized personas.
The stuff we don't put on Instagram.
Exactly. The woods is the realm of sudden emotional crises, career burnout, chaotic relationship shifts, and deep grief. You cannot schedule the woods on a Google Calendar.
But modern society tries so desperately to pave over the woods. We want to apply the laws of Athens to the realities of the forest.
We constantly look for shortcuts.
We do. We search for life hacks to optimize our emotions. We buy books on how to biohack your grief or 5 steps to getting over a breakup. We actually believe that if we just apply enough rational intellect, we can bypass the messiness of human suffering.
But the author is arguing, through the very structure of the narrative, that genuine transformation requires getting lost in the dark.
There's no shortcut.
None. You cannot transition from the immature, dependent state the characters are in during Act 1 to the integrated adults they become in Act V without going through the terrifying disorientation of the forest.
They have to be broken down.
They have to be stripped of their dignity, their certainties, and their societal titles to figure out who they actually are under pressure.
And you see this breakdown of civility so vividly in the massive fight between the 4 lovers in Act 3. Hermia and Helena were childhood best friends.
Right.
Helena beautifully describes how they grew together, like a double cherry seeming parted, but yet a union in partition. But the moment the men's irrational attentions shift and the stress of the woods sets in, that beautiful friendship violently disintegrates.
And the speed of that disintegration is terrifying.
It's instant.
When the structures of Athens collapse, their civilized veneer drops immediately. They revert to primal defensive cruelty, and they go straight for their deepest physical insecurities.
Oh, the insults are wild.
Yeah. Hermia is shorter than Helena. Under the influence of this chaotic situation, Helena attacks her height, calling Hermia a puppet.
And Hermia fires back, calling Helena a painted maypole.
And Lysander, who literally offered to die for Hermia the day before, turns on her and calls her a dwarf and an acorn.
It's just incredibly petty. But that's the point, right? When you are wandering in the woods, when your life is in crisis, you don't act like your highest, most enlightened self. You act like an animal backed into a corner.
And this challenges how we handle conflict today. We have to ask ourselves, do we recognize when we are acting under the influence of an emotional person?
That's a great question for you listening.
Yeah. When you are in a screaming match with your partner, or you are drafting a blistering, career-ending email to a colleague at 11 o'clock at night, are you operating from your rational core? Or are you wandering in the woods, blinded by the juice of your own anger and insecurity?
But that requires a massive level of self-awareness. How do we actually achieve that when we are right in the middle of the crisis? How do we apply the grace and humility required to survive the woods?
The text offers a brilliant tool for this. It's an application of what we could call cognitive diffusion.
Cognitive diffusion.
Right. In psychology, cognitive diffusion is the ability to step back and observe your thoughts and emotions without getting tangled up in them.
Oh, I like that.
At the height of the lovers' violent, absurd argument in the woods, Puck is watching from the sidelines with Oberon. Puck looks at this screaming, crying, flailing group of humans, and he just smiles and says, "Lord, what fools these mortals be."
It's the ultimate drone shot of human drama. He pans out and just sees the sheer ridiculousness of taking ourselves so seriously.
Puck is a mischievous spirit, yes, but there is profound wisdom in his vantage point. He is not emotionally entangled in their trauma. He sees the strings. He knows they are fighting over an illusion.
So the practice here, the reflection for you listening, is next time you find yourself entirely engulfed in a conflict, let's say a dispute with your neighbor about property lines, or a recurring fight with your spouse about how to load the dishwasher.
Oh, we've all been there.
Right. Or a massive turf war over an insignificant project at the office. Ask yourself, am I seeing this clearly, or am I just reacting to the dopamine hit of my current ego?
Yes.
Can you mentally step back, take that 10,000-foot view, and look at your own drama with a bit of detached, gentle humor? Can you look at yourself and say, "Lord, what a fool this mortal is"?
It instantly diffuses the tension. When you can laugh at your own absolute certainty, you break the spell of the potion. You create the psychological distance needed to respond rather than react.
And how do we apply that same grace to other people? Because it's one thing to step back from our own ego, but it's another to deal with the incompetence and chaos of the people around us.
Well, that leads us right to the leadership of Duke Theseus in Act V. So the lovers have survived the woods, they are back in Athens, they are married, and it's time for the wedding entertainment.
Right.
The rude mechanicals, the tradesmen from Athens like Quince the Carpenter and Bottom the Weaver, they put on their play, Pyramus and Thisbe.
And we cannot overstate how objectively, excruciatingly terrible this play is.
It is hilariously botched.
They stumble over their lines, they break character to argue with the audience. The guy playing the wall literally holds up his fingers to represent a crack. It is a total disaster of theatrical execution.
And Philostrate, the master of the revels, who is essentially the royal wedding planner and the gatekeeper of Athenian high culture, is deeply embarrassed by their incompetence. He literally begs Duke Theseus not to watch it.
He's mortified.
Totally. He says, "It is not for you, I've heard it over, and it is nothing in the world." He views the world entirely through the lens of performance and metrics. If it isn't perfect, it has no value.
But Theseus overrules him. And the reasoning Theseus gives is a masterclass in gracious leadership. He insists on watching the play, telling the master of revels, "For never anything can be amiss, when simpleness and duty tender it."
And he expands on this. He explains that throughout his life, he has seen great, highly educated scholars freeze up, panic, and fail to deliver their beautifully written speeches to him. But from their fearful, awkward silence, he still accepted their welcome.
He picks a welcome out of silence.
Exactly. He says, "Our sport shall be to take what they mistake, and what poor duty cannot do, noble respect. Takes it in might, not merit."
Takes it in might, not merit. He judges the effort by the intent of the heart, not the perfection of the execution. I mean, think about how countercultural that is to our modern obsession with optimization and flawless output.
It fundamentally changes the psychology of how you build teams or raise a family. If you demand pristine performance, you create an environment of fear, like the master of revels. But Theseus gives us a culture of psychological safety.
So ask yourself how you respond to the imperfect efforts of the people around you.
Yeah, that's a great reflection.
When your team at work tries to launch a new initiative and completely bungles the presentation. Or when your child tries to make you breakfast in bed and ruins the kitchen.
Flour everywhere.
Exactly. Or when your partner attempts to fix something in the house and makes it worse. Do you cringe at the incompetence? Or can you look past the awkward execution, the misspelled words on a handmade card, the slightly burnt dinner, and honor the sincere, loving intent behind it?
Doing that requires letting go of our obsession with control. And the greatest obstacle to letting go of control is our absolute terror of looking foolish. Which means we have to talk about Nick Bottom because he embodies everything modern society tries to avoid.
Nick Bottom is easily the most ridiculous character in the text. He is this arrogant, overacting weaver. During the rehearsal, he wants to play every single part. The lover, the tyrant, the lady, the lion. He is entirely full of himself. And when Puck turns his head into a donkey's head, the visual comedy is peak absurdism. Bottom's friends see him and run away screaming in terror. But Bottom doesn't even realize his head has changed. He thinks his friends are running away to play a prank on him.
Right.
So he just starts singing loudly to prove he isn't afraid.
And that terrible singing wakes up the fairy queen, Titania, who is under the influence of the potion, and she falls in love with him.
Wait, I'm struggling with this. Let's look at Bottom for a second. Because he just seems like an insufferable, oblivious narcissist. Why should you or anyone listening try to emulate or embrace anything about the guy who ruins the play and literally acts like an ass?
It's a great pushback, and the reason is that the author is presenting a deeply subversive truth here. Yes, Bottom is a fool, but what's fascinating is that Bottom is the only mortal in the entire play who directly interacts with the divine, magical, terrifying fairyland, and he isn't traumatized or broken by it.
That is true.
When Titania, this awe-inspiring, powerful, supernatural spirit, declares her undying love for him, Bottom isn't frightened. He doesn't question the logic of it. He just accepts his new reality.
He really does. He calmly starts ordering her magical fairy servants around. Peas blossom, cobweb, mustard seed. He casually asks them to scratch his donkey ears and bring him some honey. He's completely unfazed by the sublimity of the situation.
Because he lacks the one thing that tortures everyone else. Self-consciousness. Bottom doesn't have a fragile, curated ego to shatter. Modern culture is dominated by performative anxiety. We curate our online profiles, we manage our personal brands, we rehearse what we're going to say in meetings so we sound smart.
We're exhausted.
We are. The idea of being perceived as foolish is our greatest modern terror. But Bottom's lack of self-consciousness is a bizarre superpower. The play asks us to accept a very humbling reality. Sometimes we are the ones with the donkey head. Actually, most of the time, we are the ones with the donkey head. We are blind, we blunder into situations we don't understand, and we are fundamentally ridiculous creatures.
So as long as we exhaust all our energy trying to hide our donkey head, trying to maintain this illusion of perfect Athenian control, we cannot experience the magic of the woods.
Exactly.
Embracing our inherent silliness, acknowledging our capacity to be an absolute fool is deeply liberating. It dissolves the ego. If you can just say, you know what, I'm an ass sometimes and that's okay, you strip shame of all its power. You can just ask the fairy to scratch your head and enjoy the ride.
We do need to approach this text critically, though. We are reading a document written over 4 centuries ago, and not every element of it represents enduring wisdom. We must exercise discernment, specifically regarding the limitations of the author's ancient setting. There are 2 highly uncomfortable plot points that modern readers have to grapple with.
Let's start with the glaring issue of patriarchy and ownership, which we touched on with Aegeus. When Theseus tells Hermia she is merely a form in wax, imprinted by her father, and her father has the power to leave the figure or disfigure it, it's incredibly dehumanizing. We obviously discard the 16th century legal reality, where women were property. We recognize the inherent autonomy and equal dignity of every human being.
Absolutely. We can view that element historically, understanding it as the oppressive societal baseline that the author was reacting to and building his comedy upon. But the second uncomfortable element is harder to dismiss because it happens at the resolution of the play. It's the fixed ending.
Oh, this part is rough.
It is. When morning comes in the woods, Oberon has Puck administer an antidote to Lysander. Lysander wakes up in his right mind, loving Hermia again.
But they do not give the antidote to Demetrius.
They do not. Demetrius is left permanently chemically altered by the magic flower. When he wakes up, he declares his undying love for Elena. He says his former love for Hermia melted like snow, and now his natural taste is for Helena.
But the audience knows it's not his natural taste.
Exactly. He has been permanently manipulated without his consent so that the plot can tie up in a neat, symmetrical bow with two happy couples ready for a wedding.
I mean, solving a love triangle by permanently drugging someone without their consent is basically a psychological horror movie premise today.
It really is.
So how do we extract any wisdom from a resolution that is so ethically toxic?
We do it by separating the author's clumsy plot mechanics from the deeper philosophical point. Shakespeare needed to achieve the structural requirements of a comedy, which in his era demanded that everyone get married and societal order be restored.
So he just forced it.
Yeah, he wrote himself into a corner and needed a quick fix to resolve the knot. We don't defend the ethics of non-consensual manipulation, we reject the literal execution.
But the underlying metaphor still holds true. The text is pointing out that human affections are incredibly fickle, and society often relies on forced norms, a kind of societal magic, to keep the peace and create stability. Our social contracts, our marriage vows, our legal obligations are all mechanisms we use to bind people together when their natural transient desires might otherwise tear the community apart. We can appreciate the brilliant metaphor of the love Jews while leaving the 16th century ethical baggage behind.
That is the essence of critical reading. You engage with the profound truths without blindly endorsing the blind spots. And speaking of profound truths, that brings us to the final and perhaps most transcendent theme of the deep dive, the dream state and the power of imagination.
Yes. As the characters wake up in the woods on the morning of the wedding, everything that happened to them feels blurry. It literally feels like a Midsummer Night's Dream. When they return to Athens and try to explain their chaotic night to Duke Theseus, he gives an incredible, famous speech attempting to dismiss the entire experience.
Theseus is the voice of pure rationality. He cannot accept that the supernatural or the subconscious has any real power. So he says, "I never may believe these antique fables nor these fairy toys. Lovers and madmen have such seething brains."
Seething brains.
Right. And then he groups three types of people together, saying, the lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact.
Of imagination all compact, meaning they are entirely constructed of imagination. He argues that the madman sees devils that aren't there, the lover sees immense beauty in a plain face, and the poet gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name.
He's basically telling the lovers, you were stressed, you were in the woods, your brains were seething, and you imagined the whole thing. It wasn't real.
But look at how Hippolyta pushes back. She challenges his strict rationalism. She notes that while the story sounds absurd, the fact that all four lovers experience the exact same dream and their stories perfectly align means it must be more than just fancies images.
Right, it can't just be a hallucination if they all share it.
Exactly. She says their collective experience grows to something of great constancy. It possesses a profound, consistent truth, even if it defies the logical metrics of Athens.
It's the tension between literal truth and emotional truth. Just because something can't be measured in a spreadsheet doesn't mean it isn't real.
It's exactly.
And this connects deeply to broader human wisdom traditions regarding the nature of reality. In Eastern philosophy, particularly Hindu and Buddhist traditions, there is the concept of Maya.
Maya.
Yes. It's the idea that the waking material world with its rigid laws and structures is actually the illusion. The deeper spiritual reality is something we only glimpse when the conscious ego is subdued, often through meditation or, in this case, a dream state.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Stoic philosophy similarly reflects on how our minds shape our realities, arguing that our perception creates our world. Shakespeare is masterfully blurring the line between reality and illusion, asking us if the orderly, bureaucratic world of Athens is the real world, or if the wild, emotional truth of the woods is the actual reality.
And brilliantly, no character captures the inexpressible truth of that reality better than our guy, Nick Bottom.
Of course, it's Bottom.
Right. When Bottom finally wakes up, his donkey head is gone, the fairy queen is gone, and he is alone in the woods. He tries to process his encounter with the divine. He says, "I have had a most rare vision. I have had a dream, past the wit of man to say what dream it was."
He realizes that human intellect, the wit of man, is insufficient to describe the sublime. So he scrambles his senses trying to articulate it. He says, "The eye of man hath not heard, the ear of man hath not seen, man's hand is not able to taste, his tongue to conceive, nor his heart to report, what my dream was.
It sounds like hilarious jumbled synesthesia, eyes hearing, ears seeing, hands tasting. But he is actually misquoting a passage from the biblical book of Corinthians, which talks about the incomprehensible things God has prepared for those who love him.
It's amazing.
Shakespeare gives this deeply profound, almost mystical realization to the most foolish character in the play.
Because Bottom's mangled speech points to a fundamental human tragedy and beauty. Some transformative experiences absolutely defy logic and human language. When you encounter the sublime, when you truly fall in love, when you stand at the edge of the ocean, when you experience earth-shattering grief, or when you are touched by the divine, the language of Athens fails. You cannot optimize it. Your rational mind breaks down in the face of profound mystery, and all you can do is let your eyes hear and your ears see. We have to make peace with the fact that we cannot intellectualize every aspect of the human experience.
Which perfectly sets up the very end of the text. Puck steps forward, alone on the stage, breaking the fourth wall to address the audience directly in an epilogue.
Famous epilogue.
Right. He says, "If we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here, while these visions did appear."
It's a brilliant theatrical trick. He's telling the audience, if the chaos of this play was too much for you, just pretend you fell asleep in your chair and dreamed it. But it's also a deeply philosophical invitation for how we handle our own lives.
It is.
Yeah.
So consider this as you go back to your day. You carry so much weight. You carry what the text calls fierce vexations. Your anxieties about the future, your conflicts at work, the strict rules you impose on yourself to maintain control.
It's heavy.
What if you held those fierce vexations a little more lightly? What if you treated the heavy, crushing burdens of your waking life with the transient, forgiving curiosity of a passing dream? What if you allowed yourself to say, maybe this crisis I'm in right now is just a shadow and morning is coming?
When we view our rigid certainties and our deep conflicts as potentially just a midsummer night's dream, it softens our edges. It creates the space for grace.
It reminds us that we are all just wandering through the woods, doing the best we can, and occasionally wearing a donkey head.
We certainly are.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.